Israel in focus again after its parliament. The Knesset voted against the two-state solution and against the creation of a Palestinian state, a decision and a political move that has acquired a great deal of interest in the wider region, in the Middle East, as well as in the world more generally, allowing us to decode what's been happening in the region and what this might mean for India's policy in the Middle East as well. Is one of India's top diplomats, someone who has spent a career studying the Middle East, Ambassador Navdeep Suri. Ambassador Suri, thank you so much for joining us. Could you give us a sense of two major developments we've seen coming out of the region in the last couple of weeks and months? One, of course, the ICJ decision calling Israel's holdings of Palestinian territory illegal. The occupation of Palestinian territory is illegal, and of course, Israel's Knesset voting against the creation of a Palestinian state. Could you tell us what the implications are of these two twin developments that have happened over the last couple of weeks?
Absolutely, Shashank, and we are talking about these when there's a third important development which is coming up very soon, which is Prime Minister Netanyahu's visit to Washington and his address to the joint session of the Congress, and of course with whatever is happening in the U.S. election campaign, because you can never divorce that entirely from what happens in Israel and in the wider region. So let's try to unpick these one by one. On July 18th, you had the Israeli Knesset resolution, which categorically stated the opposition of the Israeli parliament to the idea of a Palestine state. And it used some fairly intemperate language to describe the possibility even of a Palestinian state as an existential threat to the state of Israel and to its citizens. Now, the reason it's significant is that for the last 50 years, more or less, all of us, most countries in the world, have thought that the solution to the Arab-Israeli conflict lies through a two-state solution. And I perhaps have been in a bit of a minority in saying consistently over the last few years that there's the rhetoric which you hear and which all of us from the US to the UN to India to a number of European countries say in our official statements that yes, it has to be a two-state solution. And then there's a reality on the ground, which is that Israel's actions in the West Bank, even before the Gaza conflict blew up, have been consciously aimed at undermining the very possibility of a Palestinian state. Now, remember, this is something that was agreed explicitly in writing at various points of time. You have the United Nations Security Council resolutions from 1967 to 73, all the way to 2024. You have the Oslo Accords signed by Prime Minister Rabin of Israel and Yasser Arafat when he was head of the PLO and the president of the Palestine Authority. And yet, you have actions on the ground that have done everything to undermine. When you look at what would constitute that Palestinian state, you have Gaza, which is in ruins, and you have the West Bank, where Israel today has 144 settlements. And they are organized in such a way that they are linked to Israel, and they have really effectively broken up the contiguity of the Palestinian towns and villages in the West Bank. So you were seeing two parallel trends at work. You were seeing a reality on the ground, and you were seeing the statements that everybody was sort of paying lip service to. I think what the Israeli Parliament resolution on July 18 has done is it's cleared those cobwebs from our eyes, and it's enabled us to see clearly that Israel has no intention, certainly not under this Netanyahu government, which is perhaps the most extreme government that Israel has ever had, that it has no intention of allowing a Palestine state. And that, in a sense, leads us up to the second development, which is only 24 hours later, you had the International Court of Justice in The Hague, giving its opinion on a reference that the UN General Assembly had made about the legality or otherwise of the Israeli settlements in Palestine, in West Bank, and the opinion given by the 14 out of the 15 judges that constitute the bench at the ICJ, including India's own Justice Dalveer Singh Bhandari, are categorical that these settlements are illegal under international law, that Israel must evacuate its settlers as early as possible, and Israel should pay reparations to the Palestinians for the damage that it has caused to them. There's an invocation to the international community, to all countries, including India, and to all international organizations, that you should not do anything that contributes to this illegality. So I think these are the two really significant developments that are juxtaposed against each other on July 18th and the 19th.
Understood. Ambassador, could I ask you, to bring this home to India? India, as you mentioned as well, has also backed the two-state solution at every turn, even when framing its response to what's happened in Israel and in the region more broadly since October 7th. Could I ask you how New Delhi will be looking at this development of the Israeli Knesset essentially saying that, look, we're going to oppose this, to the hilt? How is Delhi going to look at this?
Well, I think it complicates the task for Delhi and certainly for many other capitals around the world. We have very close relations with Israel. It's one of our strategic partnerships. There's a lot of, shall I say, respect and admiration for Israel that we see across a large section of the Indian population. Yet, India was one of the first countries to recognize the state of Palestine, and it's one of the 145 countries around the world. There's an embassy of Palestine in Delhi, for which we actually provided the land and even helped in building it. So I think what India has tried to do under Prime Minister Modi particularly is to de-hyphenate our policy of seeing Israel and Palestine from the same lens. But Prime Minister Modi visited Israel. He was the first Indian Prime Minister to go there, but he also was the first Indian Prime Minister to go to Ramallah and kind of to emphasize that point that we see these two relationships as separate and independent. But I think the contradictions will soon start catching up. To the extent that the ICJ ruling has moral weight behind it, even though it's not legally binding, I think it will force a lot of countries around the world to at least rethink their positions and at the same time to take note of what the Israeli parliament has said. I mean, if the Israelis are saying there's no room for a state of Palestine, then what happens to the UN resolutions, including those passed by Security Council over the last 50 years, including the one as recently as June of this year, with the international consensus? Is there going to be a movement by the international community to enforce those sanctions? If you ask my personal view, I think that this is where the whole notion of international law and the rules-based system that the Americans and everybody else talks about runs smack into the reality of international politics. We've been seeing the rhetoric that's been coming out of the US. If I dare say this, that if you have a Trump wants a ticket coming to Washington in January 2025 into Washington, into the White House, then their positions are so one-sided and extreme that you can probably say goodbye to the notion of international law, at least as far as Israeli exceptionalism is concerned. So you'll have this unusual combination of rules that are meant for the rest of the world to follow and to be invoked at the drop of a hat. But when it comes to the US and when it comes to Israel, you do have a completely different paradigm at work.
Understood. If I can ask you some questions that have touched upon India's balancing act in the region, of course, almost as soon as this conflict broke out, the Prime Minister put out a tweet saying that India stands in solidarity with Israel. That was at least behind the scenes, or at least in conversations reporting, seen by numerous Arab countries as sort of indicative of a tilt that India has towards Israel on this particular question. Of course, since then, there has been significant moderation in the position, and since then, India has broadly walked a fairly balanced position between the two sides. Do you think that this decision makes that job of balancing that much harder? Do you also think, and if I may ask the question I really want to ask, which is, do you think it will impact how India engages with Israel in terms of how publicly we wish to be seen or associated with Israel, especially given the fact that we have important equities in the Arab world?
Look, I think it isn't just India whose reaction will be watched. It's also a number of Arab countries who will be watched, including those that have diplomatic relations with Israel. My own sense is that you might, in the coming weeks, see a fairly strong UN General Assembly resolution asking for sanctions against Israel, asking for countries to step away from dealing with certain Israeli entities. You might see more steps to sanction certainly some of the settler organizations that have been involved in some of the egregious acts of violence. And remember, all of this we are discussing is happening at a time when Gaza is still burning, where you now have close to 40,000 Palestinians dead, according to conservative estimates, and maybe 88, 89,000 wounded, a majority of them women and children. So there is also that international outcry that you're seeing again in so many societies against the violence that is being inflicted in retaliation to the brutal attacks carried out by Hamas on October 7th. So it's all part of the mix that you're seeing right now. I think that India will continue its relations with Israel because that is the part of the realpolitik. We might increase our assistance to the Palestinians, and that's also part of the realpolitik. But going forward, I think international public opinion will start mounting against Israel. And it's really unfortunate, Shashank, that Israel is a country that many of us have admired. And that's why it's important to separate the country that so many admire from the government, which has taken such an extremist tilt and which has done so much over the last year to dehumanize the Palestinian people to the extent that to basically write out the possibility of a Palestinian state. So I think, even as we agonize over balancing acts and dilemmas, let's be very clear that for now, it's the extremists on both sides who have led us to this pass. The attack carried out by Hamas on October 7, and then the utterly disproportionate retaliation, and the manner in which at least two ministers of this government, and not to say Prime Minister Netanyahu has been shy of saying some fairly provocative things himself, but certainly the way Smotrich and Ben-Gvir have gone about openly almost calling for a genocide, calling for ethnic cleansing of Palestinians is beyond the pale. And that's where I just hope that even as all of us professional diplomats, others look at the realpolitik of it, we will also not be divorced from humanity and morality as we evaluate our options.
Right, sir. If I can ask you one final question about this, which is on increasing reports of that have come in that were even raised by the Palestinian Foreign Ministry with India's representative in Ramallah of India allegedly supplying weapons to Israel. There were numerous reports of this. There was a ship coming from India that was not given passage in Spain, and then you of course had this, like I said, the Palestinian Foreign Ministry raising this issue of India sending weapons to Israel What do you make of these reports personally? Do you think there's any credence to them? And if so, if there is credence to them, how does this impact our standing in the Arab world and more generally?
Look, Shashank, it's almost 5 years since I left the Ministry of External Affairs. And so I'm not really in a position to comment on the specifics of a particular case. But I would say that we shouldn't forget that Israel stood by us at the time of Kargil War. Israel provided us with the sensitive technologies and materials when we needed it. And so if there's a section in Delhi that feels that now it's important to stand with Israel, that's perfectly plausible to my mind. And yes, it does create complications, and I guess as diplomats, our challenges become that much harder. That we do have this very strategic outreach to a number of countries in the Arab world, and at the same time, we also have a need almost to continue with the relationship that we've built with Israel since 1991.
Understood. Ambassador, thank you so much for joining us, for giving us some of your time and explaining what's going on, the impacts of these two major developments coming out. And of course, as you were mentioning, something to keep an eye on is Prime Minister Netanyahu and his relations with the US, which will be in focus in the coming weeks. Thank you so much, Ambassador, and thank you again for watching India Today Global.